I returned from Afghanistan, and my wife asked, "Who are you?" I stood on the porch with my duffel bag, staring at the woman I'd been married to for 8 years. "Claire, it's me, David. What are you talking about?" She took a step back into the house, her hand gripping the doorframe so hard her knuckles went white. "David died. They sent his body home 3 months ago. I buried my husband." Her voice was shaking, but there was something else in her eyes. Not relief or joy that I was alive, but fear. Real, genuine fear. "What are you talking about? I've been emailing you, calling when I could. We talked 2 weeks ago about Jake's school play." My 7-year-old son appeared behind her, peeking around her legs. When he saw me, his face lit up. "Daddy!" He tried to run to me, but Claire grabbed his shoulder and pulled him back. "Jake, go to your room. Now!" Her voice was sharp, commanding in a way I'd never heard before. "But that's Daddy! He came home!" Jake was crying now, struggling against her grip. "Mommy, why won't you let me hug Daddy?" Claire's face was pale, almost gray. "That is not your father. Your father is dead. I saw the coffin. I talked to his commanding officer. This is someone playing a sick joke." She was shaking now, and I noticed her other hand was behind her back, reaching for something. My training kicked in, and I saw the shape of a phone in her back pocket. She was calling someone. "Claire, I don't know what happened or what you were told, but I'm alive. I'm standing right here. Let me come in and we can figure this out." I kept my voice calm, non-threatening, but my mind was racing. How could she think I was dead? Who had told her that? Who had she buried? "Don't come any closer." Her voice was getting higher, more panicked. "I'm calling the police. I don't know who you are or what kind of sick game this is, but you need to leave." Behind her, Jake was sobbing. "Mommy, please. That's Daddy. I know it's Daddy." A man appeared behind Claire, putting his hand on her shoulder. He was tall, maybe 40, wearing jeans and a polo shirt like he belonged in my house. "Honey, what's wrong?" Then he saw me, and his expression changed. "Who the hell are you?" My stomach dropped. "Who the hell are you?" The man stepped in front of Claire and Jake, positioning himself between them and me like he was protecting them. "I'm Ryan, Claire's husband. Now I'm going to ask you one more time. Who are you, and what do you want?" The word husband hit me like a physical blow. Her husband? I'm her husband, David Morrison. I've been deployed in Afghanistan for the past 10 months. What is going on here? Ryan's face hardened. David Morrison died in action 3 months ago. There was a memorial service. Claire received his personal effects. So I don't know who you are or what you're trying to pull, but you need to leave before I make you leave. He was a big guy, probably worked out regularly, and he looked ready to back up his threat. I kept my hands visible, palms out. "Look, there's obviously been a terrible mistake. Can we just all calm down and figure out what happened? Claire, please, it's me. I can prove it. Ask me something only David would know." Claire was crying now, her whole body shaking. The real David had a scar on his right shoulder from when he fell off his bike when he was 12. He proposed to me at Riverside Park on a Tuesday evening in June. His mother's name was Patricia, and she died of cancer when he was 19. She was reciting facts like she was trying to convince herself, not me. I have the scar. I proposed on June 15th at sunset. My mom died on March 3rd, 2011. I started to roll up my sleeve to show the scar, but Ryan stepped forward aggressively. Anyone could have found out that information. Facebook, public records, talking to people who knew him. This doesn't prove anything except that you did your homework before coming here to terrorize a widow and her son. I pulled out my wallet with slow, deliberate movements and took out my military ID. "Here, this is me. Check the photo. Check the information. Call my unit. Call the VA. Call whoever you need to call. But I'm telling you, I'm David Morrison, and I've been alive this whole time." Ryan took the ID and examined it carefully, then pulled out his phone and took a picture of it. "I'm sending this to the police. If you're some kind of imposter or identity thief, they'll figure it out fast." While Ryan was on his phone, Claire was staring at me with an expression I couldn't read. Fear, confusion, maybe a flicker of recognition. "David had a birthmark on his left hip," she said quietly, "shaped like a crescent moon. If you're really him, show me." I lifted my shirt slightly on the left side, revealing the birthmark I'd had since birth. The birthmark I'd been self-conscious about as a teenager until Claire had kissed it one night and told me it was perfect. She gasped and covered her mouth. "Oh my God, it's really you." She took a step toward me, then stopped, looking back at Ryan. "But how? They said you died. Captain Harrison called me himself. He described the attack, said you were killed by an IED. They sent me your dog tags, your wedding ring, your personal effects from your locker." My mind was reeling. "Captain Harrison? We don't have a Captain Harrison in my unit. Our commanding officer is Major Sullivan, has been for 2 years. Ryan was still on his phone, talking urgently to someone. "Yeah, he's still here. Says his name is David Morrison, has military ID that looks legitimate. No, the real David Morrison died 3 months ago. I know because I went to his funeral." The police arrived within 10 minutes. 2 patrol officers who looked skeptical as they took my ID and started asking questions. I explained everything as calmly as I could, while Claire stood in the doorway crying and Jake watched from an upstairs window. Ryan stayed close to them, protective and suspicious. One of the officers went to his car to run my information, while the other kept asking me to verify details about my service, my deployment, my unit. After what felt like an eternity, the first officer came back looking confused. "So, his ID checks out. David Morrison, active duty, currently deployed to Afghanistan, but according to military records, he's alive, and his deployment doesn't end for another 2 weeks. He looked at me. Sir, can you explain why you're here if you're supposed to be overseas? I pulled out my discharge papers. I got early leave. My tour ended 2 weeks early because our rotation got adjusted. I have the orders right here. The officer examined them while the other one made more calls. This is above our pay grade, he finally said. We need to get someone from military police or federal agents involved. This is either a massive military clerical error or something more serious is going on. They asked everyone to come down to the station. Me, Claire, and Ryan. Jake stayed with a neighbor, crying and confused. At the station, they separated us into different rooms. I spent 3 hours being interviewed by 2 military investigators who'd been called in. They checked every detail of my story, verified my fingerprints, called my unit in Afghanistan, even called my former commanding officer from my previous deployment. Finally, a woman in an army uniform came in and sat down across from me. Sergeant Morrison, I'm Lieutenant Colonel Webb from CID, Criminal Investigation Command. We have a significant problem. She pulled out a file and opened it. 3 months ago, we were notified by what appeared to be your command that you had been killed in action. A death certificate was filed, next of kin was notified, and a body was returned to the United States and buried with full military honors. She paused. The problem is, you're clearly alive, which means someone went through a lot of trouble to fake your death. My mouth went dry. Who would do that? Why? Webb leaned forward. That's what we need to figure out. The notification came through official channels, but when we started checking today, we found anomalies. The officer who supposedly signed off on your death doesn't exist. The unit information was correct, but the paperwork had subtle forgeries. Someone with access to military systems and knowledge of proper procedures created an entire false death record for you. What about the body? Who did my wife bury? Webb's expression was grim. We're working on getting an exhumation order, but based on the timing and circumstances, we believe it may have been an Afghan civilian casualty that was misidentified, either accidentally or deliberately. She pulled out more papers. Sergeant, I need you to think carefully. Who would benefit from you being declared dead? Who had access to your personal information? Who knew enough about you and your deployment to pull this off? I thought about it, my mind racing through possibilities. My wife would get life insurance, death benefits. I had a policy for $400,000 through SGLI, Service Members Group Life Insurance, but Claire wouldn't. She couldn't have. Webb was watching me carefully. Your wife remarried very quickly, only 6 weeks after your supposed death, to Ryan Kendrick, a financial advisor who specializes in military families and veteran benefits. The implication hung in the air between us. You think Claire and Ryan planned this together? That they faked my death for the insurance money? I felt sick, but she seemed genuinely shocked to see me. The fear in her eyes was real. Webb pulled out more documents. Or maybe she was shocked because she thought whoever they'd paid to handle this had actually killed you, and seeing you alive meant their plan had failed. She showed me bank records, emails, text messages between Claire and Ryan that dated back over a year, while I'd been deployed. Messages about insurance policies, about how to file death benefit claims, about finding someone who could handle the paperwork. My hands were shaking as I read through them. I was in Kandahar. I was doing convoy security, base operations, everything normal. How would you fake a death with my unit right there? Webb explained what they'd pieced together. Someone with access to military databases filed false casualty reports. We're still tracking down who, but we believe it was an insider, either someone in admin or someone who'd hacked the systems. The person they buried was likely a local casualty from an actual IED attack. Your personal effects from your locker were taken by someone who had access to the base, probably bribed or paid to steal them. Everything was timed to look legitimate. She pulled out photos of Ryan. Ryan Kendrick has a brother, Michael Kendrick, who works as a contractor on military bases in Afghanistan. He had access to personnel areas. We believe he's the one who physically stole your personal effects and may have been involved in the identity swap with the body. They kept me at the station while they arrested Claire and Ryan. I watched through a window as they were brought in separately, Claire crying and protesting, Ryan silent and cold. Jake was placed with Child Protective Services temporarily until they could sort out custody. I wanted to go to him, to explain somehow, but they said it would be better to wait until things were clearer. Over the next few days, the full scope of what had happened emerged through investigations and interrogations. Claire and Ryan had been having an affair for over a year, starting when Ryan had helped her file some insurance paperwork while I was on my previous deployment. They'd hatched a plan to have me declared dead so Claire could collect the insurance money and they could be together without the mess of a divorce. Ryan's brother Michael had been the key. He worked as a supply contractor at Bagram Airfield and had access to personnel areas. They'd paid him $50,000 to steal my personal effects and help create the false death record. The body that was buried had been an Afghan civilian killed in an actual IED attack on a convoy. Michael had helped misidentify it as me through falsified dental records and corrupted DNA samples. The death notification had gone through because someone in the admin chain, they were still tracking down who, had been bribed to process the fake paperwork without proper verification. The life insurance company had paid out $400,000 to Claire within 6 weeks. She and Ryan had already spent $75,000 on a down payment for a new house, a new car for Ryan, and paying off their debts. The rest was in accounts they'd planned to access slowly to avoid suspicion. What they hadn't counted on was me coming home 2 weeks early due to a rotation change. If I'd stayed in Afghanistan for those final 2 weeks as originally scheduled, they would have had more time to move money around and establish themselves. By the time I came home, they'd hoped to have everything locked down tight enough that even if questions arose, the paper trail would be too complex to unravel. But my early arrival had caught them off guard. Lieutenant Colonel Webb told me that Claire had initially refused to believe I was real because accepting it meant accepting that her plan had failed and she was going to face serious consequences. The shock on her face wasn't joy that you were alive, Webb explained. It was horror that you weren't dead. The federal charges were extensive: conspiracy to commit fraud, identity theft, making false statements to federal agencies, theft of government property. Michael Kendrick was arrested at Bagram and faced additional charges for his role. The admin person who'd processed the fake paperwork turned out to be a sergeant with gambling debts who'd been paid $30,000 to look the other way. I filed for emergency custody of Jake, which was granted immediately given the circumstances. When I finally saw him again at the CPS office, he ran to me and wouldn't let go, crying into my chest. "I knew it was you. I told Mommy, but she wouldn't listen." Why didn't she listen? How do you explain to a 7-year-old that his mother had tried to fake his father's death for money? The therapist they assigned to help him suggested focusing on the fact that I was alive and we'd be together, leaving the details for when he was older. Jake asked about Claire constantly. Where was Mommy? When could he see her? Why couldn't she come home? The supervised visitation at the jail was heartbreaking. Claire cried and tried to explain that she'd made terrible mistakes but still loved him. Jake was confused and angry, asking why she'd told him I was dead when I wasn't. She had no answer that made sense to a child. The exhumation of the grave revealed exactly what the investigators had suspected. The body was that of an Afghan civilian male, approximately my age and build, who'd been killed in an IED attack. His family in Afghanistan was eventually identified and notified, adding another layer of tragedy to the whole situation. They'd been told their son had been given a proper burial, not that his body had been used as part of an insurance fraud scheme. The trial took 8 months. Claire's lawyer tried to argue that she'd been manipulated by Ryan, that she hadn't fully understood what they were doing, that she'd been emotionally vulnerable while I was deployed. The prosecution destroyed that defense with the emails and text messages showing she'd been an active participant in planning every detail. Ryan got 15 years in federal prison. His brother Michael got 12 years. The admin sergeant who'd processed the paperwork got 8 years. Claire got 10 years, with the possibility of parole after 7 if she showed good behavior and paid restitution. The life insurance company sued to recover the $400,000 plus interest and legal fees. The house Claire and Ryan had bought was seized. The car was repossessed. Their bank accounts were frozen and emptied. Even after all that, there was still over $200,000 in debt that Claire would be paying off for the rest of her life. I rebuilt my life slowly. The Army gave me extended leave to deal with the legal proceedings and to help Jake adjust. We went to therapy together twice a week. Him for dealing with trauma and loss, me for processing betrayal and anger. Some days were better than others. Jake had nightmares about coffins and funerals. I had nightmares about coming home to a wife who wanted me dead. My unit was supportive when I eventually returned to duty, but the story had spread through the military community, and I couldn't escape the whispers and the stares. The guy whose wife faked his death, the soldier who got buried while he was still alive, the man who came home to find someone else in his bed. My command offered me a transfer to a different base, and I took it, both to get away from the attention and to give Jake a fresh start somewhere new. We moved to Colorado, where I took a position training new recruits. It was good work that kept me stateside and let me be fully present for Jake. Dating was impossible. How do you explain your history to someone new? My ex-wife is in federal prison for faking my death to commit insurance fraud. It wasn't exactly first date conversation. I tried a few times but always ended up sabotaging things before they got serious, unable to trust that someone wouldn't betray me again. Jake asked about Claire less as time went on. The supervised calls from prison were difficult. She'd cry and apologize, but couldn't really explain in terms he understood why she'd done what she'd done. Eventually, he asked if we could stop the calls because they made him too sad. I agreed and didn't force it. She'd made her choices and now had to live with the consequences. 2 years after everything happened, I got a letter from Claire in prison. She'd been going through therapy and 12-step programs and wanted to apologize, to explain, to somehow make amends. She wrote that the affair with Ryan had started innocently, but escalated, that they'd convinced themselves I wouldn't really be hurt because I'd never know, that the money would give Jake opportunities and security. She wrote that seeing me alive on the porch had shattered her completely because she'd spent 3 months believing I was dead, mourning me while also feeling guilty about the insurance money. She'd convinced herself the lie had become truth. I read the letter once and put it in a drawer. Maybe someday I'd be ready to forgive, but not yet. Not when I still woke up sometimes wondering if I was safe, if someone else was plotting against me. Not when Jake still occasionally asked if I was really real, or if this was a dream. The settlement with the insurance company took 3 years to fully resolve. They recovered most of their payout, but I received $50,000 in compensation for emotional distress and the identity theft. I put it in a college fund for Jake, When he asked what the money was for, I told him it was to make sure he had opportunities, that something good could come from something bad. Lieutenant Colonel Webb stayed in touch, updating me as they uncovered more details about the fraud ring. My case had opened up an investigation into other suspicious military deaths, and they'd found 2 more cases where deaths had been faked for insurance money. The military overhauled their casualty reporting procedures, adding multiple verification steps and outside audits to prevent similar fraud in the future. Small comfort, but at least some good came from it. Jake started calling me Pops instead of Daddy around age 9, wanting to seem more grown up. He did well in school, made friends, played soccer. Most people in our new town didn't know our story, which helped him feel normal. When kids asked about his mom, he'd say she lived far away and he didn't see her much. Not exactly a lie. By the time he was 12, I felt like we'd found our rhythm. We had our routines, our inside jokes, our way of being a family, even if it was just the 2 of us. He knew his mother had done something very wrong and was paying for it, but we didn't dwell on it. We focused on moving forward. Claire sent letters occasionally, usually around his birthday or holidays. I always gave them to Jake and let him decide if he wanted to read them. Sometimes he did, sometimes he didn't. I never pressured him either way. She wrote about missing him, about how she was working on herself, about hoping someday to be part of his life again. When Jake was 15, Claire was granted parole after serving 7 years. She'd been a model prisoner, completed every program available, and convinced the parole board she'd been rehabilitated. She moved to a halfway house 3 states away and started working at a dry cleaning business. She called asking if she could see Jake. He was old enough to decide for himself, so I asked him. He thought about it for 2 days before saying yes, but only if I came with him. We drove 6 hours to meet her at a supervised family visitation center. She looked older, thinner, with gray in her hair she'd never had before. She cried when she saw Jake, who was now taller than her, and looked like a young man instead of the little boy she'd last seen. They talked for an hour while I sat in the corner, watching. She asked about school, about his interests, about his life. He answered politely, but with distance, like he was talking to a stranger, because in many ways, she was. On the drive home, Jake was quiet. Finally, he said, "I don't think I want to see her again for a while. Maybe when I'm older and can figure out what to say to her, but not yet." I told him that was okay, that he could take all the time he needed, that there was no rush to figure out his relationship with her. He nodded and turned up the music, and we drove the rest of the way home in comfortable silence. I retired from the military after 22 years of service, ready for a change. I got a job as a contractor training security personnel, better pay, more stability, and no more deployments. Jake was 17 and thinking about colleges. We visited campuses together, talked about his future, made plans like normal families do. Sometimes people asked if I'd ever found out why Claire had really done it, beyond just the money and the affair. Psychologists who'd evaluated her said she'd been dealing with abandonment issues from her own childhood, that my deployments had triggered fear and resentment, that she'd rationalized the betrayal as a way of taking control of a situation where she felt helpless. Maybe that was true. Maybe it was more complex than simple greed. I'd never know for sure, and after a decade of processing it, I'd made peace with not knowing. What mattered was that Jake and I had survived it, that we'd built something good out of something terrible, that when people asked him about his father, he could say I was a veteran who'd retired from the army and now worked in security, not the man his mother had tried to have declared dead. Jake graduated high school near the top of his class and got accepted to several good universities. At his graduation, he gave a speech about resilience and overcoming adversity without mentioning specifics. But when he thanked his father for showing him what real strength looked like, I saw several teachers who knew our story nodding with tears in their eyes. We celebrated that night at his favorite restaurant, just the 2 of us like always. He was leaving for college in 3 months, and I was already bracing for the empty house. But I was proud of the man he was becoming. Honest, hardworking, careful with trust, but not cynical. He'd taken the trauma and turned it into wisdom. The last time I spoke to Claire was 2 years after her release, when she called asking if I'd signed paperwork, allowing her to move out of state for a better job opportunity. Parole terms required my permission since Jake was still a minor, and there were custody considerations. I talked to Jake first. He was 19 by then, in his 2nd year of college, and said he didn't care where she lived. "She's my biological mother, but you're my parent," he told me. "Whatever makes your life easier is fine with me." I signed the papers and mailed them without a phone call. Claire moved to Oregon, and we lost touch completely. Jake never brought her up, and I didn't ask. She'd become a footnote in our history rather than an active presence in our lives. Looking back now, from a decade's distance, I can see how the whole thing changed me. I'm more cautious with trust, more aware that people can hide dark intentions behind familiar faces. I'm grateful for small mercies, that I came home when I did, that Jake was young enough to adapt but old enough to remember the truth, that the Army investigated thoroughly enough to find the other fraud cases. Sometimes I wonder about the parallel universe where I stayed in Afghanistan those extra 2 weeks. Would they have killed me for real to tie up loose ends? Would Claire and Ryan have gotten away with it? I'll never know, and I've learned to be okay with that uncertainty. The hardest part isn't the betrayal itself anymore. Time and therapy have dulled that knife. The hardest part is knowing that for 3 months, my son mourned me, that he cried at a funeral for a father who was still alive, that he processed grief and loss that shouldn't have existed. I can't give him back those months of thinking I was dead. I can't undo the nightmares or the therapy or the confusion. All I can do is be present every day since then, prove through action that I'm alive and not going anywhere. Jake's 25 now, working as an engineer, dating a nice woman he met through friends. He calls me every Sunday, we text throughout the week, and we get together for holidays and birthdays. We've built a relationship not just as father and son, but as two people who went through something terrible and came out the other side still caring about each other. That's more than a lot of families can say. People ask if I'm bitter, if I hate Claire for what she did. The truth is, I don't think about her enough to hate her anymore. She's a person who made catastrophic choices that destroyed her own life, along with nearly destroying mine. She lost her son, her freedom, her reputation, and years of her life to prison. That's consequences enough without me adding my hatred to the pile. What she did revealed something I wish I'd never learned, that anyone is capable of almost anything if their circumstances and motivations align in the wrong way. That love can curdle into something unrecognizable, that the person sharing your bed might be planning your funeral. But it also revealed resilience I didn't know I had, the unconditional love between a father and son, and the support of a military community that rallied around us when everything fell apart. If I could go back and prevent it all from happening, would I? Of course. But I can't. So instead, I focus on what I built from the rubble. A good relationship with my son, a successful second career, a life that's maybe smaller and more cautious than it could have been, but honest and real. That's enough. Last year, on the anniversary of the day I came home to find Ryan in my house, Jake called me unexpectedly. "I just wanted to say thank you," he said, "for handling everything the way you did, for not making me choose sides or feel guilty, for letting me process it all at my own pace. I know it wasn't easy for you." I told him he never had to thank me for being his father. That's just what parents do. They show up, they protect, they do their best, even when their best doesn't feel like enough. We talked for an hour about nothing important, just catching up on his work and mine, making plans to meet for dinner next month. After we hung up, I sat on my porch and thought about that day 10 years ago when I stood on a different porch with my duffel bag, staring at a wife who claimed not to know me. How completely my life had shattered in that moment, then slowly pieced itself back together into something different, but whole. The scars are still there, the wariness, the occasional nightmares, the knee-jerk suspicion when things seem too good to be true. But scars are proof of healing, evidence that wounds can close even when they leave marks. I went back inside and pulled out an old photo album I rarely looked at anymore. Pictures of Claire and me on our wedding day, young and happy and convinced we'd figured out forever. Pictures of Jake as a baby, as a toddler, as a kid who loved his mother and believed the world was safe. I studied those images of people who didn't know what was coming, and I felt something that wasn't quite forgiveness, but also wasn't hatred. Maybe compassion for the wreckage of what could have been. Then I closed the album and put it back on the shelf. The past had its place, but it didn't own me anymore. I'd survived the impossible, being declared dead while I was still alive, coming home to find my life had been stolen. If I could survive that, I could survive anything. And I had Jake, who'd survived it too, and turned into someone I was proud to call my son. That was enough. More than enough. Everything else was just details in a story I'd lived through and learned from, and eventually, mostly, moved past. Tomorrow, I'd wake up and go to work and call Jake and live my life like the millions of people who've faced betrayal and found ways to keep going. 'Cause that's what you do. You survive, you adapt, you build something new from what's left. And someday, when someone asks about the hardest thing I ever went through, maybe I'll tell them about coming home from war, to find my wife had tried to erase me from existence. Or maybe I'll just smile and say, everyone has their struggles, and what matters isn't what happens to you, but what you do with what happens. Either way, I made it through. We both did, and that's the only ending that really matters. Sometimes the worst betrayals come from the people closest to us, but surviving them proves what you're really made of. Subscribe if you want more stories like this. Until next time, take care.